Sophie Beren is a self-described unifier and the founder and CEO of The Conversationalist, a nonpartisan educational platform empowering Gen Z to break out of their echo chambers, have difficult conversations, and unify the world. The Conversationalist community is comprised of over 100,000 young people, which is how I was first introduced to Sophie. She has been recognized as a unifier in America by the White House and was named Forbes 30 Under 30 on the 2023 education list. Sophie's work has been featured on Good Morning America, The Washington Post, and even on a billboard in Times Square. Thank you for chatting with us today, Sophie.
Anne Marie, Chanel, thank you so much for having me and for those kind words. I just feel so lucky to be here.
We're so excited to have you. Could you just talk to us a little bit about yourself, the conversationalist? Just give us some background information.
Absolutely. I mean, you already gave my bio, but I guess what I can share is that from a young age, I really had a desire to bring people together. And the way I introduce myself is that I'm a unifier. I feel like I was put on this earth to have these conversations and help people unify. And I've been doing that now for about 10 years. It started as some work I did in college and has transitioned into what the conversationalist is now. But I just have this passion to help people learn how to coexist, not because we have to, but because we want to. And there's no shortage of difficult things happening in the world and issues to cover and traverse. And the only way forward is through and through conversations. So that's a little bit about me. I live in New York City, and I'm getting married in May, which is crazy. Um,
Congrats.
Thank you. It's wild. But yeah, my greatest joy in life is human connection and having these conversations. So excited to have a conversation with y'all today.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'll start off asking you about how did the Conversationalist come to be? So you started off like kind of in college, like building this up, but how did you start making this community?
Ooh, okay, well, I'll try to give the abridged version. But I grew up in Wichita, Kansas. Have either of you been to Kansas before?
No,
I
not
haven't,
yet.
but I've seen The
Well,
Wizard of Oz, so.
oh, okay. So basically, you've been there, but you have to go at some point. And from an early age, like I mentioned, I knew that I wanted to do something in the world that helped other people, but I always felt like I couldn't because I felt like I didn't have a voice. And the reason why I felt that way is because from the earliest days of pre-K and in lower school, I realized that I was really different from my friends and classmates.
Mm.
I realized that I was the only Jewish student in my grade for K through 12 education. And for whatever reason, as much as I tried to fit in, I still felt like I stuck out and was always othered for that. And as I decided to find where I was going to go for college, I wanted to go somewhere far away. I wanted to find people who were more like me, who shared my views, my religion. And so I went to the East Coast for college. And before I knew it, freshman year, I surrounded myself with only other Jews. I joined the Jewish a cappella group, the Jewish sorority. I even found a Jewish boyfriend. My parents were thrilled. But I had this realization one day as I was walking through campus that everyone else who I had met in a classroom or at a dining hall, they were doing the exact same thing as I was, but with their respective group. And it hit me that maybe belonging really wasn't about surrounding myself with people who were like me, but actually it was what I had at home that I was taking for granted in Kansas. So, all of that to say, it led me down this journey of wanting to try to help other people have that realization and harness the power of their voice through surrounding themselves with people who are different from them. And that is really how the conversationalist came to be. It was really after a pivot from the organization I started on my college campus. It was called Table Talk at the time. Similar vibe, 1.0 version, just bringing people together outside of the classroom to have these conversations, and then realized that other friends on other campuses had the same issue as I did. So before I knew it, I spread Table Talk to 80 college and high school campuses, and then realized that there was something more to this issue, which was the echo chamber. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but that's what led me to start the Conversationalist and try to create not just a platform for individual campuses to connect, but a place for our entire generation to gather and have these conversations across difference.
Amazing. And a lot of the work at The Conversationalist really centers around the importance of youth. So I want to ask you, why do you think Gen Z is so important?
Anne Marie, how much time do you have? I I think that's such an important question, because I'm sure the two of you have felt this from time to time, but I think Gen Z gets discredited a lot. And a lot of people have doubt in, who we are. I'm a Zillennial myself, so I straddle the millennial and Gen Z generations, which I think gives me a unique POV into what different experiences and lived realities are. But I think what we're seeing now is a generation that's grown up with such a unique set of circumstances, whether it was, going to kindergarten during 9/11, growing up during a financial crisis and a recession, going to high school during a global pandemic. There's been no shortage of school shootings. I think this generation has been through so much. And for the first time, really feels like a generation that isn't just going to point fingers and pass those issues down to the next generation. We're taking it upon ourselves to do something about it. And so I think young people are no longer just hoping for change. It's becoming embedded in our DNA. We expect equity. We expect something to be different from what generations past have been handed. And I think what we're seeing now with young people starting to enter into politics, Maxwell Frost being our first Gen Z member of Congress, we're starting to really enter these spaces that have been the same for so long, and we're actually making a difference. So I think young people are no longer the leaders of tomorrow, like everyone says, but we have just kind of taken it upon ourselves to do something because it's really impacting our day-to-day lives.
Oh, amazing. And also, you talk about this idea of unifying the world being the core of the conversationalist. So, what is kind of, in your opinion, this idea of unifying the world?
Absolutely. And Anne-Marie, would love your thoughts on this too at some point, because I know you've been on our show and you're such an important part of what we do. And I'll say our mission to unify the world really stems from the purpose of why we exist. We serve as a platform and a community designed to bring people closer together. And the way I describe our vision of unity or a unified world is by describing a salad. So I think where people get it wrong is they think of unity as a soup. You take all of these ingredients that have different shapes, textures, colors, sizes, and you put them into a blender and they completely mix together and you lose all of their original characteristics. And while soups can be beautiful and, great for a cold day, really what we're aiming for with the work that we do is more of a salad where we can bring people from these separate ingredient bowls to one bowl. And by mixing these ingredients together without losing their original characteristics and properties, you could argue that a salad with all of those ingredients is much better than just eating the ingredients on their own. And so what we're trying to do is help bring people to that salad bowl and realize that there is something greater. And, by joining that salad bowl and coming closer to someone, you're not losing who you are, right? You're just learning how to coexist and retain who you are while also becoming closer to someone else's point of view. So when we say unifying the world, it's a process of bringing people closer together by having these conversations that open up our bubbles and our preconceived notions and our echo chambers so that when we step out of our own little bubble, you're inherently closer to someone who has a different point of view than you were before. So I think people get it wrong when they think that unity is that soup mixture where you're just holding hands and kumbayaing and foregoing your beliefs. And that's absolutely not what we're trying to do. Unifying the world does not happen overnight, but it's that process of getting to the bowl and showing that, again, we can coexist, but still retain who we are and let others do the same.
Yeah, I love this idea. I've never heard of it put this way before, because especially in New York City, we're always talked about it's a melting pot. It's a melting pot of different people from different places, religions, and everything. And I really think one of the biggest key or biggest elements that make New York what it is like you can jump from one place to another and experience a different culture, a different point of view. And it's so important not to lose that thing that makes you authentic, and it brings such a different flavor and color to life that we live in.
I love that you're just jumping on the salad metaphor. It's catchy. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think we get afraid to go outside of our comfort zones. And we
Mhm.
think that having a conversation with someone who's different will make us a bad person or will change our views or, will reflect poorly on who we are, when in reality, it's the opposite. It reaffirms your own beliefs, it makes you stronger. And, we live on an earth with so many different types of people. And I think the only way forward is to learn how to live alongside our neighbors in a way where we, can coexist. So it's a process, but maybe I'm an optimist, but I really believe that that's possible.
Definitely. And I think it's so interesting too, because sometimes I feel like the United States, just the landscape of things are so polarizing. People have very strong opinions that are either very like left, right. There's no like real center. And I feel like, especially when I travel, I hear this a lot from people. They're like, oh, Americans, everyone feels this way or this way. Why don't you just come together and agree? And so I think it's interesting because I think we're missing those conversations where we're coming together to kind of discuss, but it can be really daunting. And so I'm wondering for you, what is the purpose of a conversation? Like, is it, some people think it's to change somebody's mind. Some people say it's more to learn. Like, what exactly is a conversation for you, and what should we get out of it?
And that's so real, what you brought up. I think there is this false sense of needing to agree and find that middle, when in reality, we don't have to necessarily find a middle ground, which leads to your question. I believe that there needs to be more of a difference between conversations and debates.
Mm.
I never did debate in high school. I honestly wish that I would have, because it probably would have helped me with some of my arguing skills today. But I think in a debate, it's very clear that there's a winner and a loser. And you enter into that conversation with, muddied expectations around who is going to win and who's going to come out on the top or the bottom. But a conversation is the opposite. It's something that's meant to have no necessary end date, and you're not supposed to try to make it a sprint or have a winner. And I think that's the distinguishing factor that needs to be made more often today, because conversations are so often had with the intention of winning or bringing someone over to your side, when in reality, conversations should be a really comfortable place to learn and to try to understand someone else's opinion or point of view or experience that is unlike your own. And there are so many things that make or break a conversation. And I think the biggest factor is knowing what the intention is going into it. And not enough people set that expectation, which is why conversations can end in such a heated way. It can end relationships and is often the thing that people dread the most. When in reality, I think if you can set the right environment to just be there to hear each other out, to better understand, you're much more likely to uncover that middle ground or find things that you share when you're not rushing and you're not seeking for a winner.
I love that. I think it's so interesting too, because even just growing up, my parents were always like, there are three things you never talk to people of like your friends about. You never talk about politics, religion, or money. And so I feel like I grew up with this mindset of like, there are certain things that are off the table. Like, I can't talk to people about this. And so that's why I love the conversationalist so much, because it really just encourages you to rethink that mindset, rethink what a conversation is, and what you can get out of it.
That's so interesting. Chanel, did you have that experience too, where you kind of grew up knowing that there were things you weren't supposed to talk about?
Yeah, for me, I feel very comfortable talking about religion, but I was brought up in a very like religious context. I think for me, the biggest things were race and sex. These were the things that I couldn't talk about either with my family or with friends because it would just be so uncomfortable.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, I resonate with that so much. I feel like from such a young age, there was no one there setting that example that these are things that should be talked about. Everything was stigmatized and it just
Mhm.
wasn't part of the culture. Um, so I hope that if anything, being able to bring these conversations to the forefront and have these issues be at the top of our minds, while can be a lot, it can be a lot, it can be very overwhelming, anxiety provoking. At least they're being had, which I think is, half the battle.
Yeah. I think also when you grow up in a community where everyone kind of either looks like you or thinks the same way that you think, you kind of get into like this mindset as this is the right way to think.
Mm.
And then when, especially like in college, it was the first time I was experiencing being in a community where everyone didn't think like me, didn't look like me. And it was the first time I had to step back and be like, okay, like are my thoughts the actual truth? Is this the reality? And then sometimes like it was good to have these conversations with people who are different from me, because then I was able to step outside of myself and expand on, like, I don't know, what I thought about the world.
That's amazing. That gorgeous unlearning period that I think everyone experiences at different points in their life. And I think it's really that bursting of the bubble when you finally open your echo chamber and realize that there are other people, experiences, and perspectives out there that are different from your own. You start to question what you were taught. And I think it can be beautiful to start really identifying your voice and
Mm,
not just because of what you were told. So it's amazing to hear that you've had that experience. And I just
mm,
only wish that people knew that at an earlier age.
yeah. For you, Sophie, like, did you have that moment you were like, wow, you step back and like, maybe this thought I had wasn't actually like the truth, or you like change your perspective about something because of what somebody else has told you?
All the time. All the
Mm,
time. I think the defining moment for me was when I had that moment on campus where I
mm,
realized that really what I had been taught my whole life, which was, I was the other. So I need to go find people who are like me. And then, like tribalism or, what cavemen did back in the day, I was just supposed to stay with my group and that was it. When
mm,
I finally realized that kind of like I really found that my campus felt like that scene in High School Musical where they're singing Stick to the Status Quo. And finally, like what something hit me in the face. I was like, what are we doing here? Every college prides itself in its rich student diversity, but then we come to campus just to huddle in groups of people that look like us and think like us. And that was the first time where I really feel like I thought for myself that something was wrong and that maybe I didn't have the whole picture in what I was telling myself about growing up. Um, so for me, it was that particular moment. But what about the two of you?
Oh man, I can't think of a specific moment at this time, but I think it was just going to college, kind of like you, like growing up in Kansas. I was living in Staten Island for most of my life, and so very homogeneous community. I always felt like an other, just because there's not a really large Slovak American community here, and so I think going to college, it was really intimidating to be surrounded by so many people that were not like me. They didn't look like me. They didn't act like me. There's so much to learn. And I was so afraid to have conversations with people. I didn't know like the right vocabulary to use when talking about things. I didn't want to offend people. I was trying to be politically correct, which is actually a huge problem. And so I don't know. I think honestly, I think me and Chanel's friendship, I feel like that's where I first started having like really like intense conversations like this. And just with like we were involved with an international club on campus. We had a lot of international students, and we were all just like sitting down and talking like in between class breaks. So for me, I think that's where like my echo chamber first started to break down.
That's
yeah.
amazing.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say for me the same, like in that club room, which is pretty much how we got here to the podcast. Like everyone I don't know why, I felt like we seeked out being in an international space where people didn't look like us or didn't think like us. And it was during the time of Black Lives Matter. Of course, when you have to have a conversation that deals particularly with your own identity and people don't see that, or like the conversations, I just felt like I had to really fight for like my view and my opinion. But then I had to also kind of step out of this viewpoint and be like, okay, maybe they don't understand my perspective because their perspective is different. Like, let me try to put myself in their shoes and see why they might be missing some of the points that I'm making, or maybe the points I'm making are very, very like just focused on me. So trying to expand this a bit more. But it was definitely a turning point in the way that I had conversations and in the way I saw people as well.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And I think that even touches on what people get wrong about conversations too, which is people are only there for their own personal gain at times, or they're only showing up with their own wants and needs. And conversations, in my opinion, really only become conversations when they become a two-way street or you
Mhm.
involve more people. And I think that's beautiful that you had the patience and the desire to want to engage in that way, because oftentimes people will feel that frustration and then leave. And, I think it's just about showing people what is to be expected in that conversation, and it can make for a beautiful outcome.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think it's interesting too, like that you say that process of unlearning is so beautiful, but it's also really painful and it can be really
Mhm.
scary at the same time. I mean, sometimes there are ideas or thoughts or things I thought I knew, and I would realize that like this idea I had held for so long, it actually wasn't true, or there were other facets to it that I hadn't been exploring. And so I'm wondering, in your opinion, like what are ways that people can kind of take this first step towards like unlearning or just expanding that mindset without also like feeling like they have to give up this person that they are and what they believe in?
That is such a big question, and I don't know if I'm qualified to
I don't think
give
anybody is.
all of that advice, but I think for me, it all started with giving myself grace. I think one of the best things we can do as human beings is recognize that we are the way we are because of the unique circumstance that we were born into, with the specific set of lived experiences that we've inherited, and what we've been taught, and how we've gone through the world. And the person even sitting next to you in your class growing up, or your neighbor, could have still had a completely set of different experiences. And I think that unlearning happens when you interact with another person or an area of the world that shows you another way. But I think we can be so hard on ourselves for reasons sometimes out of our control, whether it be cancel culture or, political correctness, like you mentioned. But it starts with giving yourself grace and realizing that you are the way you are because of those circumstances. But for me, the most important shift is trying to recognize what you do with those circumstances.
Mm.
So when you're able to start that unlearning or relearning, whatever it may be for one person, you have to recognize really like where your views came from and why you are the way you are, so that when you start exposing yourself to different viewpoints, you start from somewhere that's really rooted in your own voice. Um, and for me, that's kind of how the process needs to start. And I think outside of that, just doing whatever you can in small actions throughout your day or your week to expose yourself to different views. And you're right, it can be painful. So everyone needs to go at their own pace. But for me, it was simply starting to follow accounts on social media that have different views than I did. And while that may seem commonplace now, at the time, like that also felt a little uncomfortable. And I think seeking out views and seeking out perspectives is really a beautiful place to start so you feel comfortable. And then when you're ready to engage with someone else and have a difficult conversation, you feel like you're more secure in your voice and what
Mhm.
you believe in. And you've also been able to entertain other viewpoints so you know how to react when those views come up.
And you touched upon this idea, like once you feel ready and more secure within your voice, to start being able to have different difficult now conversations. How would you say is the best way to kind of navigate this? And sometimes it can happen in different places as well. Sometimes it's with family, sometimes it's with friends, sometimes it's a coworker. So at least for you, Sophie, like how do you navigate this?
And Chanel, you're asking about just how to navigate different difficult conversations.
Mhm.
Whew. This is this is something I'm learning every single day. And I'm just like constantly gathering different techniques from different people. Like even Anne Marie, from watching you on our show, like I feel like I'm constantly learning new things. But I think in addition to what we've already talked about, which is like
Mhm.
intention setting, like
Yeah.
why are you having this conversation? What do you hope to get out of it? And trying to share that with the other person. I think something really crucial that often gets missed when it comes to difficult conversations is giving consent to have it in the first
Mhm.
place.
Mm.
Have either of you ever had a really heated conversation that either you were trying to put on someone else or someone was trying to put on you that you just simply were not prepared or ready for?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
like, how did that feel?
It felt terrible. I was like, I just feel like sometimes for these conversations, you need to be in the right state of mind to have it. So I feel like
Mhm.
not that there's an appropriate time and place, but to some extent, I feel like you need to gauge the other person's interest. And so I feel like sometimes people just like throw things at you. And I'm like, I cannot mentally handle this right now. Like, we need to take this outside. And so I think it's also important to know how to like step away from that conversation, but it can be really hard if it's something you're passionate about. And I feel like, at least for me, I get very I have like a very strong emotion. So for me, it's like I feel bad if I like step away from the conversation instead of engaging. And so I don't know, it can be so emotionally draining for me.
Absolutely. I mean, Chanel, what about you?
Yeah. I know me and Emery got into argument a few months ago. And it was mostly because, at least for me, I was just not in the headspace to have the conversation. And when it was brought up, I was just, I don't know, I didn't expect it to come. So I really exploded. And I don't think the way I communicated my feelings was the most appropriate way. And it could really have an impact on your relationship with people when you don't have this expectation, or even the intention setting, like you said, that this is going to happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, what both of you just shared is so real. And all of that to say, I think something really important to navigate is whether you're ready to have the conversation in the first place.
Mm,
You know, people will spring things on you and put their emotions on you because oftentimes these conversations can be really hard. But it's important to remember that you do not have to have that conversation if you're not ready. And at the same time, you need to afford that grace to your conversation partner, if you will. So if it's something that you've been wanting to bring up for a long time, I always encourage the float. Like
mm,
float it by someone first. Like, hey, there's something I really want to talk to you about. It's been on my mind. I'm not sure if now's the right time, but is now a good time? Or if not now, when would be a good time? Will you let me know? And then I oftentimes feel a little bit of anxiety if someone says that, but I don't know what they want to talk to me about. So I think
yeah.
it's fair to like share a little bit about maybe what you want to talk about and say, hey, you know, I something wasn't sitting right with me when this thing happened, but I don't want to spring this conversation on you. When you're ready, I would really love to just learn more and reach an understanding. It's all about how you present the idea.
Mm,
And I think that's the best thing you can do when it comes to conversational consent. So that plus intention and expectation setting
yeah.
really creates the right grounds for dialogue. But then we could go on and on about different tips and, you know, tricks that I've learned, but those I think are the most important ones that oftentimes don't happen because people don't know that you can advocate for yourself,
Mm,
advocate for more time, and make sure that you are in the right headspace to have it in the first place.
yeah.
I think setting those boundaries is so important because I mean, even with me and Chanel's situation, like we've been friends for years and I didn't know that this was gonna like set her off. And so I can only imagine like having that conversation like of so much intensity with a stranger could be an even like
Mm,
more daunting task. But I love, first of all, you're killing it with the metaphors. I love the
God.
float idea, but I feel like it really just puts into context the fact that a conversation is a two-way street. It's not all about you. It's not all about the other person. Because I feel, at least for me, I always feel like a burden of responsibility to really like express myself in these conversations. I've always felt like I had to change somebody's mind, but I didn't really like, I wasn't able to conceptualize that until recently.
Mm.
And I feel like sometimes there's a lot of ego that goes into conversations. So you kind of have to put that to the side.
Which can feel impossible. Like it can
It
feel when
it
you care
can.
so much. So
mm,
again, you got to give yourself some grace. And I think what you said, Anne Marie, about it being a two-way street is just important to emphasize one more time because I will say, like, when it comes to boundary setting and wanting to take that time and space, I think
mm,
we're of a generation now that is so comfortable with what is being coined as therapy speak. Like, here are my boundaries, and here's what I need for my own mental health. But I
mm,
think we forget sometimes about that effect on others. So in a conversation, I just like really urge people that it has to be push and pull. You know, you're never going to reach a common ground on your own. So
mm,
if you're setting a boundary, you know, just think about how that is having an impact on someone else. And, you know, at the end of the day, protect, you know, your own peace and sanity, but just recognize that it has to be both ways at some point. So afford someone else the same grace if they're asking for it.
mm,
Definitely. And then I
mhm,
also wanted to ask, I feel like a lot of times people feel like when they're having conversations, they have to be an expert on the topic to kind of participate or to get engaged. And so I'm wondering like how do you think people can navigate getting into conversations where they might have an opinion, but they're not as knowledgeable about it? I feel like sometimes people just like throw facts at you if they're really like passionate about something. And I'm just like, wow, I thought I knew something about this, but now all these facts are being thrown at me and I don't know if this is true or not. And it just
Oh
becomes
my
so
God.
overwhelming where I just want to like shut down.
It's a lot. And that's happened to me so many times. And the
mm,
best thing I can say is try to be humble. Humility can be your greatest strength in a conversation, especially around topics that are sensitive or difficult. because at the end of the day, you could be the world's #1 expert on a topic and still have blind spots, right? There's so much to learn. And I think, again, we can get it wrong if we go into a conversation thinking that we have all the answers. So I always say, try to be as curious as possible. A metaphor, bringing so many metaphors into the
I love
conversation
it.
today. But something that we love using in our community is thinking about yourself in a conversation as a judge in a courtroom. You know, before a judge lays down the gavel with the verdict, you know, they're seeking out every answer, every perspective possible before they make a judgment or a decision. So whenever possible, you know, try in that conversation where maybe you don't know enough to gather all the data, you know, do some research of your own, try to bring in other perspectives, and just remember at the end of the day, like you don't have to put the gavel down if you're not ready to. And I think it's harder to teach someone else humility, but I find that mirroring can be really helpful in a conversation. So the more that you are curious and asking questions and showing that you may not know everything, it kind of lets the other person off of their guard. And at the end of the day, you can be an expert in your own experience. And it's okay if that experience is that you just don't know enough. And that's really okay. Because I think we see nowadays with, you know, especially hot buttoned issues like what's happening right now in Israel and Gaza, you know, we see the opposite where people are trying to make an assumption or make a decision or share their view and try to pretend like they know everything about our world's oldest conflict, when I think it actually can be more refreshing to say, hey, I'm still learning. I'd love to better understand, you know, how you arrived at this conversation. Maybe what gaps do I have? And just continue that learning process because none of us have it all figured out.
Yeah. And I love that you say you don't have to be an expert. And it is so true that it's valid that you just have your own experiences, and that experience is already information enough to share. I think sometimes we just discredit ourselves for things like that. You know, your feelings, your lived experiences, it's all valid. And that is like what makes you you. It's what you can contribute and share with people. Because at the end of the day, facts, I mean, some people might not like this, but I feel like facts are arbitrary. I mean, history is also arbitrary. There's so many different sides to things. I mean, there's 365 days in a year. Like different things happen every day. There's things that are like information's constantly flowing, life is constantly moving. Like there's no way to know everything. And so I don't know,
Totally.
your experience is really valid. So I love that you said that.
Thank you. And this, I might get heat for saying this, but like, I feel like we're living in a facts-free era. Like, no
I
one
feel
can
the
seem
same.
to decide on what is truth and what is not. And of course, there will always be things that we should be able to find truth in, but I don't know. I feel like maybe it's just my intake of media and social media, but we can't seem to agree on anything.
Like
So
anything.
truly. So I think it's important to just recognize what you can control, which is your own experience. And my therapist, not to bring in therapy speak, always says that you are only responsible for your 50% of the 100% of that relationship or conversation. So at the end of the day, you can't control what someone else is going to say or think or perceive. But at the end of the day, you can be responsible for your own 50%.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask, because not everyone's in communities where they're able to access conversations with people who are different from them. So what kind of tools, like for you, you said you were starting to follow like different Instagram channels that kind of maybe had a different point of view. So what recommendations would you give someone who wants to break their own echo chamber?
Well, obviously I'm biased, but I would say first and foremost, if you're interested, join our community. I know, Anne Marie, you've seen it firsthand. We have a group of people that gathers daily on our Geneva app, which is kind of like Discord, where there are people there every day from different areas of the country and the world that are just chatting about their days, current events, and just that exposure to other people's viewpoints, I find to be very refreshing and helps me remember that there are views outside of my own. So, you know, if not our community, try to find communities of people that have those different viewpoints. Secondly, again, I'm biased, but I created an account on Instagram that I don't often share, but I really hope can be a resource. And if you search it, it's called Break Your Echo Chamber. And you'll see that I followed a certain amount of accounts, and that following list are accounts that for me have opened my echo chamber. It's different news sources, different people, different public figures that all kind of bring different perspectives into your feed. So if you don't care about your following count, I would just follow all of those. And that at least helps me know that if there's a current event happening, I'm much more likely to see it from different angles than just the account that I'm following. And then lastly, have either of you heard of All Sides?
No, I don't think so.
Well, I'm so excited to tell you about them. They're one of our partners, and they're essentially an organization that helps fight media bias. So what they'll do is they'll show what's happening in the world, but giving you headlines from the left, the right, and the center.
Oh, I love that.
They're a brilliant resource. They're very trustworthy. And they also have an incredible resource called their media bias chart. So you can even go on for yourself and see where these news publications are that you already trust fall on that spectrum. You know, what outlets are really far left, you know, left of center, right, centrist. Like it's very interesting. So I would recommend following them on Instagram and then from time to time going onto their website and kind of just sifting through their media bias chart.
I love that. I've been really into kind of seeing both sides of a story, because nowadays you just never know. You never know.
Really. And it might not always be both sides to a story. I think there are multiple facets to everything, and the least we can do is start exposing ourselves to more than one.
I think it's important, especially as youth. I feel like we don't really trust the media as much anymore, and so I think this is a really good resource for people.
I'm
Oh,
excited
thank
to hear what
you,
you guys think.
Sophie. Yes. And before closing out, we always ask our guests to say the first thing that comes to their mind and the last thing they want to leave the listeners with.
First thing that comes to my mind, does it have to be, can it be anything?
It could be
Anything.
anything.
It could be a hot take. It could be anything you want
Oh
it to
my
be.
gosh. Okay. I just got back from the Super Bowl. I'm a big Chiefs fan because I'm from Kansas.
Yeah.
And I just want to put it out there just to have it on the record that Taylor and Travis are endgame.
Oh
Like,
my gosh.
I don't care what anyone else thinks. I just got into a huge fight with my doorman about the
Oh
Super
wow.
Bowl and
Conversation.
Taylor, but like this is so on my mind right now. And I think for anyone who's giving them a hard time, like it doesn't matter. They are endgame. They will marry, and it's just a matter of time.
Oh, I love this. I love this so
many
much.
thoughts. I have so many thoughts.
I know.
Oh
So
wow.
we can save that for another time, but that's the first thing that came to mind. I'm a huge Swiftie, but I'm also a huge Chiefs fan. So this has been like such a Super Bowl
Perfect.
year.
No.
And then the last thing I want to leave your listeners with is that sometimes I think the simplest thing you can do to make a more unified world is to listen to someone else with the same fiery passion that you feel for being heard.
That's beautiful and amazing and true.
Yeah,
definitely. And thank you both so much for creating this space to have these conversations. And I'm just excited for more in the future. So thank you for having me.
So signing off, this has been Chanel.
This was Anne-Marie.
And this is Sophie.
And thank you for coming to Sweet 15.
Yay!
The recording has stopped.